Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world of quiet footsteps, polished silver, and whispered secrets. A world that existed just out of sight, beneath chandeliers, behind velvet curtains, and down long creaking corridors. We're talking about the secret routines of 18th century butlers, men who held the keys to entire estates, yet rarely spoke, who moved through candlelit halls before dawn, and retired only when the last ember dimmed. They knew everything and said nothing. Their routines were rituals, their silence was power. But before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and drop a comment, letting me know where you're watching from, and what time it is. I love knowing who's sharing the quiet with me from across the world. Now, settle in, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or some soft background noise, and get comfortable, because tonight, we're going somewhere slow, somewhere hushed. Let's set the scene. Before the world of the house awoke, before the rattle of coal scuttles, the hum of the scullery maid's broom, or the creak of the master's slippers on the upper floor, there was him, the butler, already upright, already dressed, already moving, not with haste, nor sloth, but with a rhythm shaped by years, by duty, by the clock of service. It was not an alarm that summoned him from bed, but a deeper awareness, a bodily instinct formed by repetition, so precise that timepieces merely confirmed what his bones already knew. Each morning, in the final hour of night, and the first hush of dawn, he began his invisible work. The estate around him remained wrapped in the blue-grey veil of pre-dawn. This was the Georgian countryside, perhaps somewhere in Surrey or Shropshire, surrounded by hedgerows and mist-softened fields, with a grand house at its heart, a symmetrical structure of pale stone and tall sash windows, perfectly aligned in Palladian pride. Within its walls, the noble family dreamed undisturbed, floating somewhere far above the concerns of latches and fire embers. But below, in the quiet passages and the stone-floored servant halls, a different life stirred. It was a life of service, of ritual, and it began, always, with the butler's footsteps. His room was modest, though not Spartan, positioned off the servants' corridor, but near enough to the steward's office and the wine cellar to be reached without delay. The bed, made of dark walnut, was neatly covered in a wool blanket. At its side, a wooden chair, a wash basin, a blacking brush for boots, and a small iron stove, whose coals he never let fully go out. His uniform hung waiting, pressed the evening before, black wool coat, buttoned high and sharp, starched white cravat, knotted with sober elegance, breeches cleaned without a speck, shoes polished to a dull, respectful shine. There were no medals, no flourishes, no signs of personality, only function, only form, only the quiet dignity of a role well understood. Dressing was its own ceremony, a pause before the long performance of the day. The butler did not rush this act, nor did he linger. His fingers knew every fold, every fastener. A glance in the small mirror told him all he needed to know. Not about vanity, but about readiness. He had to become, each day, the embodiment of control, poise, and silence. For the butler was not merely a man. He was the house's stillness made flesh. The first sounds of his day were not made by him, but by the house itself. The soft crack of cooling wood, the distant drip of yesterday's rain from the eaves, the groan of the great oak doors settling against their iron hinges. These were the breathing noises of a structure that had stood for generations, and the butler listened to them, as one might listen to a familiar tune. Any new sound, a shift of glass, a misplaced creak, would not go unnoticed. The house had its rhythms, and he was their keeper. With a small lantern in hand, its wick trimmed the night before to ensure a clean light, he began his rounds. First to the entrance hall, where the great double doors faced the gravel drive like silent sentinels. He checked the locks, 3 iron bolts, polished and oiled, and noted the weather through the frosted glass. Then on to the dining room, where the long mahogany table waited, draped in shadows. He brushed a fingertip lightly across its edge, checking for dust that ought not to be there. In the parlor, he straightened the fringe of a rug, and made mental note of a footman's oversight, a poker left leaning instead of lying flat beside the hearth. Such things were never ignored, though never mentioned in haste. The correction would come later, calmly, quietly. He moved next to the drawing room, lantern held low to catch any imperfections in the carpet or disarray in the embroidered cushions. The light was faint, flickering across the ivory cornices and the heavy crimson curtains. This was a room not yet awake. Later, it would hum with the chatter of guests and the scent of tea, but now it waited, and so did he. Down the back hallway, he moved next, the soles of his shoes muffled by the thick wool runners he had chosen years ago for just this purpose. Past the servants' stairs where the maids still slept in their shared attic rooms, past the scullery door, behind which the cold water in the basin had yet to ripple, he paused at the wine cellar. Not to enter yet, but to listen. The barrels, he knew, whispered their own truths. If one was quiet enough, no rat scuffle, no damp scent. Good. Onward to the breakfast room. Here, he opened the shutters slightly, not fully, for the lady of the house disliked bright light upon first rising. The long case clock in the corner ticked solemnly, as if acknowledging his presence. He removed a cloth from the sideboard, inspected the silver tray, checked that the porcelain cups were in perfect balance upon their saucers. The teapot, later, would be warmed by a scalding rinse. The toast rack placed just so, all would be in readiness, but not yet, all in time, and still, the house above remained asleep. Upstairs, behind closed doors and heavy drapes, the family slept in fine linen sheets, attended in dreams by none of the cares that governed the man below. But he did not resent this. The butler understood the order of things. He was not servant by misfortune, but by choice, or perhaps by calling. There was a certain nobility, he believed, in the perfection of unseen duty. He made his final round through the library. Here the scent was thick with old paper and beeswax. He straightened a chair, turned a globe half a degree to the east, repositioned a small jade paperweight. His fingers left no prints. His breath disturbed nothing. When the great clock in the main hallway chimed the 5:15, he was already done. The house was still, yes, but now it was ready. It would wake into a world that appeared effortless, a world where things simply were. But that illusion was his doing, his design. The butler extinguished the lantern, placed it precisely where it belonged on the iron hook near the cellar stair. The silence around him remained unbroken, and somewhere above, a bedroom curtain shifted, the first stirring. Soon the scullery maid would descend, the kitchen fires would be lit, life would resume its surface-level hum. But for now, for just a few more moments, he stood in the quiet, not proud, not weary, simply present. The first soul awake in a house of sleepers, and he waited, in the shadows he kept, for the day to begin. The butler's morning routine was more than preparation. It was performance, identity, and quiet mastery. Dressing was not simply a functional task, but a ritual so practiced and precise that it had come to define him more fully than even his name. In the Georgian household, names were whispered, if spoken at all. The butler, in particular, was often referred to not by forename, but by his role. He existed not as a man but as a presence, polished, pressed, and perpetually composed. By the time the first servants had begun to descend the stairs, still rubbing sleep from their eyes, he was already dressed. Yet the act of dressing, executed with silent discipline in his private quarters, was one of the most important parts of his day. It was in this silent hour, just after the house had been secured and inspected, that he transitioned from the soft wool of his night clothes to the symbolic armor of his profession. There was no wardrobe brimming with choice. The butler's uniform was not about style but about strict conformity. Hanging from a simple iron hook, the garments waited in the same arrangement as always: white linen shirt, high-collared waistcoat, cravat, tailored black coat, breeches or dark trousers depending on the year, and a pair of low polished shoes. The materials were of fine quality, but not flamboyant. Black wool and crisp white linen were his palette, colors of restraint, formality, and quiet power. He began with the shirt, stiff with starch, its edges carefully ironed by the laundry maid the day before. It was lifted with both hands the way one might handle parchment or a sacred item. Sleeves drawn gently over the arms, buttons fastened from the collar downward with slow practiced movements. Over this went the waistcoat, closely fitted and of heavy black cloth. Its buttons were polished by hand every third evening, even though no guest would ever see them. Next came the cravat, neither flamboyant nor showy, as might have been seen in the fashions of young noblemen, but precisely folded and tied. The knot was tight yet elegant, a symbol of containment and order. The ends tucked neatly into the waistcoat. It suggested control of breath, of speech, of presence. The coat followed. Its cut was deliberate, tailored to give a formal shape, never slouching, never creased. It bore no insignia, no flair, no decoration, save for the sheen of the brushed wool. It was the exterior mask of the man, concealing fatigue, weather, age. It was expectation, stitched and buttoned into fabric. Finally, the shoes, black, low, leather, clean to a gentle shine, but not so glossy as to draw attention. He would walk miles in them each day, though never hurriedly. The soles were thin and soft enough to avoid noise on hardwood. The butler did not announce his presence by footfall. In fact, he was often not noticed at all, until needed. This silence was intentional. Georgian manuals and servant codes emphasized discretion as the first law of the domestic class, and none embodied it more than the butler. One guidebook from the era declared that a butler must be ever near, yet never intrusive, present but unseen, a guardian of routine and form. His entire existence depended on this art of refined absence. While the footman below stairs might laugh quietly at jokes, or the scullery maid hum a tune to herself as she boiled water, the butler made no sound. His silence was both practical and symbolic. Practically, he moved without disrupting conversation, without drawing attention to his actions. Symbolically, it reminded all others, both family and staff, that he was not of the same realm, not of leisure, nor entirely of labor. He existed in a liminal space, neither master nor mere servant, and he maintained that space through the controlled disappearance of self. Once dressed, the butler performed what might be called the mirror inspection, but he did not admire or judge his appearance. He merely confirmed it. A glance sufficed. Is the cravat straight? Are the cuffs even? Are the coat tails cleanly falling? No hair out of place, no dust on the lapel, no scent lingering. His face was shaved smooth before the sun rose, his nails trimmed, his breath checked with a dash of mint leaf water, not for vanity, but to ensure no discomfort when leaning close to accept or deliver instructions. Such things mattered, though they were never acknowledged. At times when the house hosted dignitaries or great banquets, additional elements would be added, white gloves for serving wine, or a special pin on the lapel marking royal recognition. But these were rare, and he viewed them less as adornment and more as obligation. His goal was never self-expression, it was erasure, to serve so completely that the service itself became invisible. The silence extended beyond sound to motion. Every gesture was deliberate, no wasted movements, no fidgeting. When walking, he kept to the sides of corridors, never blocking doorways. When entering a room, he paused at the threshold before stepping in. When bowing his head, it was slight but exact. This was the butler's vocabulary of posture, of bearing, of restraint. This performance was not born of affectation, but of structure. Georgian society was a world of hierarchy and ritual. Everyone had a place, a role, a way of dressing, a way of behaving. The butler, paradoxically, had great power, but only so long as he stayed precisely within the lines drawn for him. He was the chief servant, responsible for managing the household, the wine, the silver, and often the accounts. He knew the master's weaknesses, the lady's habits, the staff's secrets. Yet, to misuse any of that knowledge, to show pride, or too much familiarity, would be ruinous. Dressed and ready, he took one final moment before exiting his room. This pause was not indulgence. It was control. A final breath, measured, and shallow. A mental checking of the day's duties, the events scheduled, the guests expected. He mentally prepared for any variations, the cook's moods, the new footman's inexperience, the subtle changes in Lady Ashcombe's tea preferences. The butler began his day not just clothed, but composed. The uniform was not just worn, it was inhabited. Then he opened the door to the corridor, stepping into the muted, flickering lamplight with quiet feet and the weight of responsibility tucked neatly beneath his cuffs. He would now pass silently through the spaces others would fill. The family would never see the transformation, the staff would never witness the preparation, but the result, the perfectly calibrated man who ran the estate's heart, would be felt in every moment of the long day ahead. The uniform was now fully worn, the posture settled into form, the silence practiced and preserved, and so the next phase began, one of the most delicate and symbolic aspects of the butler's quiet dominion, unlocking the house. This was not merely about security or access, it was a solemn, daily rite. In these early moments of dawn, with the world still cloaked in shadow and the staff yet to stir, the butler became the guardian of thresholds. The house was still asleep, not just in the dreaming minds of its owners, but in its very bones, and only he could gently wake it, one key at a time. Upon a small oak shelf within the butler's pantry rested the object that defined this power, the key cabinet. It was not elaborate, nor large, but its simplicity belied its weight. Crafted in dark wood, with a single brass latch, it bore no markings, no inscriptions, yet within it hung dozens, sometimes well over 100, carefully labelled keys, each resting on its assigned peg. Some were wide and ornate, with filigreed shafts and delicate teeth, others were plain and narrow, tarnished by decades of turning iron tumblers, and every one of them had its place. The butler opened the cabinet with his own master key, a heavier piece worn smooth with age and touch, and paused to scan its contents. Though he knew them all by heart, this act was part of the ritual, a silent confirmation of order before motion. The keys hung in groups, sorted not merely by location, but by importance. At the top, the keys to the wine cellar and silver vault, below the pantry, the linen closet, the larders, and the strongbox, then keys to storerooms, gun cabinets, attics, servants' quarters, and outbuildings. Finally, at the bottom, keys long unused spares, relics and those that opened doors, forgotten by all but him. Each morning, he selected a curated handful. Not all were needed every day, but some, such as those to the main entrance, the dining room cabinets, and the breakfast sideboard, were essential. He chose them silently, sliding them onto a small chain, or slipping them into the deep interior pocket of his coat. A few were looped discreetly on a fob worn beneath his waistcoat, never visible, never jingling. The sound of keys was a sound not permitted to his role. They were to be present, but silent, like everything else he carried. As he made his way through the corridors, keys in hand, the house responded to his touch, not with sound, but with a shifting of stillness. The first locks he approached were those nearest the servant hall, storerooms, coal cupboards, and back passage doors. These were functional spaces, yet even they required his permission to enter. No cook or footman was permitted to unlock without his oversight. It was not a matter of mistrust, but of structure. He alone held the full map of the estate's internal life. Next came the cabinet of silver, tucked into a discreet closet off the formal dining room. Here, he paused. The key to this cabinet was perhaps the most jealously guarded. Within it were rows of neatly stacked trays, serving forks, dessert spoons, ladles, and ornate gravy boats. Each piece had its velvet-lined cradle. The cabinet was inventoried weekly, and anything missing was not only an embarrassment, it was a breach of trust. The butler did not count pieces now. That would come later. For now, he opened the cabinet, allowed it to breathe, and inspected that nothing had shifted in the night. From there the routine continued. The wine cellar was next, a low, cool chamber beneath the rear staircase. Accessed through a stout iron-banded door, it required 2 separate keys, one to the upper latch, one to the lower bolt. The door groaned softly open, revealing the gently pungent scent of aging oak and dust. The rows of bottles remained where they had been placed weeks or months before, each labelled in the butler's own hand. He made no adjustments now, only confirmed the absence of disturbance. If a footman or errant visitor had strayed where they should not, he would know. At every door, every cabinet, the butler moved not like a man performing chores, but like a priest tending an altar. The ritual was deliberate, slow, and precise. Unlocking was not just a mechanical act, it was a granting of access, a statement of readiness. Each opened lock said, "The day may begin," and in this way, the butler slowly resurrected the house from its nightly stillness. There was symbolism too in the very possession of the keys. In 18th century households, especially grand country estates, control of keys was more than logistical, it was political. Among the staff, possession of a key marked rank. The cook, for instance, might have one or two for pantry doors. A housekeeper, perhaps, had keys to linen cupboards and storage rooms. But the butler alone held the master set. He could enter any room, any vault, any passage. His knowledge was intimate, spatial, temporal, and social. He knew which doors must never be opened too early, which must always be locked before guests arrived, and which were never to be touched at all. There were also keys never used, held in trust. One, long and rusting, opened the old gun cabinet, rarely touched now since the master had given up hunting. Another, even older, unlocked a servant's room that had not been occupied since the previous butler died in his sleep a decade ago. These keys he carried, nonetheless, for possession alone meant responsibility, and he bore the full weight of the house's history with him. At last, his route brought him to the front entrance, though no one would use it for several hours. This final unlocking was significant. The great double doors, framed by fluted columns and heavy cornices, were rarely touched, except by visiting gentry or invited dignitaries. Yet the butler unlocked them daily, inspecting the bolts, oiling the hinges, ensuring that the house could greet the world when required. The doors remained closed, of course, but now they were ready to open, should the master so command. Having completed his circuit, the butler returned to the pantry. There he replaced the unused keys, relatching the cabinet with a firm but silent click. It was now just after 6. The scullery maid had likely begun to stoke the kitchen fires. A footman would soon arrive to prepare the breakfast room, but none of them knew which doors had already been touched, which vaults confirmed, which latches tested. That was the butler's realm, and in that quiet, key-bearing hour, he alone had carried the house from darkness into wakefulness. By the time the sun's rays barely crept across the frost-kissed windowsills of the great house, the butler was already deep into his solitary rounds. These early hours, long before the first clink of silverware, or the sound of boots upon polished floors, were devoted to quiet preparation. The grand estate, though slumbering above, stirred ever so gently in the undercurrent of his labour, a careful choreography of sight, scent and touch that would never be witnessed, only experienced in its absence if something went awry. He moved through the dim corridors in a soft gliding rhythm, guided by memory more than light. His eyes, long trained to navigate by the faintest flicker, could distinguish between shadow and soot, between the forgotten ash of yesterday's warmth and the promise of today's fire.
Oh!
In each room, he paused at the fireplace, not for warmth, but for order. He would crouch silently, his dark wool coat absorbing the chill as he scraped away the remnants of previous comfort, replacing them with carefully arranged coal. Fire was not merely heat, it was ritual. The hearth was a statement of civility, control and comfort. It could never be left to chance or error. There was always coal dust on his gloves, no matter how cautious. The soot clung like a badge of honor and a curse. Too much, and it marred the polished brass. Too little, and the room felt unlived. With a brush in one hand and tongs in the other, he struck a balance, unseen but ever present in the results. Each fire must be ready to spark to life at the soft command of a match later that morning when the family began to stir. But until then, they must lie dormant, waiting, like actors in the wings. Next came the candles. They were the soul of the Georgian interior, flickering with intention and mood. Candles were trimmed by hand, an exacting task. If the wick was too long, it would smoke too short, and it would drown in its own wax. The butler moved from sconce to sconce, room to room, checking each taper with the same reverence one might give to a holy relic. He carried a long candle snuffer and a small trimming scissor tucked discreetly in his coat. He never let the scent of smoke linger. A mismanaged candle might offend a guest or, worse, ignite a curtain. More than anything, it was the expectation of perfection that governed his movements. The mistress of the house might never see the dust that settled overnight on the piano keys, but he saw it. The master might never notice that the fringe of the rug near the east window was askew, but he straightened it just the same. The butler's work was anticipatory. He lived in the future tense, always imagining how a room would look, smell, and feel when others entered it, and correcting anything that did not align with the invisible ideal. He polished surfaces not only for shine but for symbolism. A spotless side table meant control. A gleaming banister whispered of stability. He did not decorate. He maintained. His was not the realm of creativity but of consistency, and the tools of his trade were cloths soaked in beeswax, brushes worn smooth with repetition, and 100 tiny cloth-bound notebooks in which he recorded household stock, cleaning routines, and minor irregularities. The preparation of the drawing rooms was especially delicate. These spaces were the social heart of the household, where guests lingered and reputations were made or unmade. The arrangement of chairs, the alignment of books, the folding of draperies, all required judgment. The air must not smell of last night's tobacco or stew, but of lavender, beeswax, and fresh fire. It was a kind of pre-dawn alchemy, transforming the stale remains of yesterday into the dignified promise of today. In this early hour, he was more than a servant. He was a caretaker of the estate's identity. Every room he touched was a silent testament to tradition, to the family name, and to the butler's own craft. The marble-topped tables, the gilt-framed portraits, and the velvety footstools were not just furniture. They were pieces in a living diorama that communicated wealth, propriety, and respectability. Silence was still his companion, broken only by the occasional creak of an ancient stair or the soft whoosh of curtains as he moved from room to room. In that silence, he found a sense of ownership. No one else in the household would see the rooms like this, empty, cold, raw, and waiting. No one else would ever know how they became warm and inviting. That transformation was his domain. Before the first servant was summoned, before the first bell rang, or the first horse neighed in the stables, the butler had already prepared the stage. The coal had been laid, the wicks had been trimmed, the mirrors had been polished until they caught the morning light like silver ribbons, and the house, from cellar to ceiling, was ready to awaken. It was not glamorous work. It was not work that earned praise or applause, but it was the quiet foundation upon which the estate rested. Without it, the illusion of ease and grace would collapse. And so, the butler continued, hands dusted in coal, pockets full of candle trimmings, eyes already watching for the next imperfection. This was not service. This was stewardship, a solemn duty passed down in hushed tones and detailed ledgers, a way of life built upon the mastery of invisible things. In the grand estates of the 18th century, breakfast was not merely a meal, it was a statement. The table served as a canvas, and every element placed upon it was a brushstroke meant to reflect the status, refinement, and wealth of the household. And behind this silent symphony of silver, porcelain, and precisely boiled eggs stood the butler, an unseen conductor guiding a morning ritual that few truly understood. He moved through the hours before the family awoke like a phantom, unseen but always present, his work so seamless that it disappeared into the illusion of effortlessness. By the time the sun began its lazy ascent and amber light poured through the long sash windows of the breakfast room, the butler was already deep into his day. He had coordinated the maid responsible for polishing the silver the night before, ensuring that each spoon and serving dish gleamed without a hint of smudge. He had approved the menu with the cook, a discussion that, though quiet and brief, was a delicate negotiation between household routine, seasonal availability, and the known whims of the household's master or mistress. If the mistress preferred lighter fare in the spring, or had taken to a fashionably continental taste for chocolate or coffee over tea, The butler knew this before she ever entered the room. The butler's orchestration of breakfast began not in the dining room, but in the scullery and the servants' corridor, long before even the lowest footman had rubbed the sleep from his eyes. He ensured the footman tasked with setting the table understood every detail, from where the toast rack should sit in relation to the egg warmer, to the correct orientation of each silver knife, fork and spoon. The heavy linen cloths, sometimes embroidered, always pressed, were laid with a reverence that bordered on spiritual. To the footman and junior staff, it was a matter of duty. To the butler it was a sacred trust. What made the butler truly invisible was his mastery of timing. The dining room was not to be disturbed by the bustling noise of preparation. All doors and trays must pass silently. No plate should arrive too early and risk cooling. No clatter of footsteps should break the family's calm entrance. If a guest were to appear unexpectedly, perhaps a cousin from Bath or a London acquaintance passing through, the butler would have already accounted for the possibility. Additional place settings could appear without any overt instruction. He knew the rhythm of the house, and he adjusted accordingly. He did not serve directly at the table unless a special occasion or formal breakfast demanded it. Instead, he oversaw the footman, who carried in the trays and dishes, offered bread, carved ham or poured tea. Yet every item offered came from his unseen hand. He stood just beyond the archway, behind the threshold of perception, quietly noting everything. If the milk had cooled too quickly, or the toast had dried, it would be replaced before it could become an issue. He memorized preferences, how the young master liked his eggs, how the lady preferred her tea, and whether the visiting aunt took sugar or not. These were the unspoken codes by which he measured his success. No less important was the mood of the morning. The butler understood that breakfast set the tone for the day. If the master emerged in a foul mood, perhaps having read unsettling news in the London Gazette, or received a troubling letter, the butler might subtly adjust his staff's visibility, reducing the number of interruptions or delaying non-urgent tasks until tempers cooled. He would ensure no draught reached the master's chair, that the fire burned warmly but not too fiercely. All of this was done without a word, without even the family realizing that anything had changed. Yet, for all this preparation and presence, the butler remained, as always, a ghost. To be acknowledged at breakfast was rare. A nod from the master or a gentle inquiry about the Morning Post was the closest most ever came to interacting with him during the meal. And that, in truth, was exactly as it should be. For the true art of butlery, especially in the 18th century, was to make the household run so perfectly that no one noticed the hands that made it so. Once breakfast concluded, and the family rose to begin their day, perhaps to riding, reading, or receiving callers, the butler would already be steps ahead. He oversaw the swift and silent clearing of the breakfast table, the relighting of hall lamps, and the transition to the business of the day. Breakfast had passed without event. There had been no accidents, no delays, no disruptions. In the world of the butler, this was the definition of perfection: presence without recognition, action without applause. And so, as the porcelain was returned to the scullery and the kitchen staff turned their attention to luncheon, the butler moved on with purpose. The morning had passed. The gears of the household had turned without a squeak. He had done his duty, unseen, unknown, and yet utterly essential. After the last teacup was cleared, and the faint scent of smoked haddock or poached eggs lingered like a passing whisper in the grand breakfast room, the butler withdrew not to leisure, but to perhaps his most discreet domain, the butler's pantry, and the adjacent study. This quiet chamber, often mistaken by guests as a simple utility space, held one of the most important artifacts in the household, the ledger, bound in thick, dark leather. Its pages were yellowed and worn from years of careful handling, but the information contained within was anything but decayed. It pulsed with the very life of the house, capturing its secrets, rhythms and indiscretions. The butler approached this ritual of writing, not as a chore, but as a sacred trust, where ink met paper with a reverence usually reserved for church liturgies. Each morning he opened the ledger to yesterday's entry, reviewing it with the precision of a barrister reading over court proceedings. The columns, drawn with perfect symmetry, were filled with handwriting that resembled engraving more than penmanship. There were records of wine decanted and not returned to the cellar, of silver forks polished and found one short, of laundry returned with a collar frayed more than it had been before. Deliveries from the grocer were listed by weight and timestamp, while the florist's visits were cross-checked against the events scheduled by the lady of the house. But more than these logistical entries, the ledger was a record of loyalty and lies, its neat lines concealing whispered tensions and small rebellions within the staff. The butler knew what to look for. A scullery maid's increasing tardiness, politely excused at first, might begin to form a pattern, a prelude to a dismissal. A footman's repeated absences from his station during post-dinner clean-up might hint at moonlighting in the village, or worse, inappropriate dalliances in the servants' quarters. Such matters weren't punished hastily, but noted, observed, and often used as silent leverage. The ledger, therefore, became not only a tool of management, but one of influence. The butler never raised his voice, never needed to confront. He simply recorded, and the knowledge that he was always watching was often enough. Even the master and mistress of the house were not spared this quiet scrutiny. While their names rarely appeared explicitly, references to their eccentricities and lapses in decorum were delicately coded. A broken wineglass at a late hour might suggest a domestic quarrel. An unexpected bouquet delivered from an unknown sender could mark the start of a whispered scandal. These entries were framed as logistics. Items delivered, schedules adjusted, staff repositioned, but within them was the soft, meticulous imprint of judgment. The ledger judged with silence, and the butler, its sole priest, administered this gospel of domestic order with unwavering precision. Within these pages, too, lived the seasonal ebb and flow of the household. The Christmas season meant not only greater deliveries and elaborate menus but also increased tensions among overworked servants. Spring brought new linens from London and often new maids, fresh-faced country girls unfamiliar with the invisible etiquette of the grand estate. Their missteps were recorded gently at first, with notations like needs instruction or unfamiliar with service rhythm, but repeated mistakes turned into dark blotches on their service record. Promotions, bonuses, and dismissals were often decided not with raised voices or direct confrontation, but by referring to these quiet daily reports that only the butler controlled. He sat at his writing desk with a posture that never slumped, even when alone. His pen was dipped not lazily but with deliberation, and he blotted ink as though each drop mattered. Around him, the room was lined with ledgers from decades past, each a silent chronicle of the household's evolution. Some pages described joyous eras, the arrival of new heirs, great family celebrations, and smooth seasons of staff harmony. Others bore silent testimony to hard years, illness, misfortune, scandal, or economic downturns reflected in more frugal orders and diminished footman ranks. To the butler, the ledger was a memory longer than any servant's term of employment. Staff came and went, masters aged, children grew, heirs moved away, but the ledger remembered. It held every flaw and favor, every debt of duty and every betrayal. It was not read by others, nor was it ever shared, but it was felt. The staff knew that their names were in it, and that the ledger's favor could mean advancement, while its disapproval could precede the quiet delivery of a final wage packet. As midday neared and the household buzzed just beyond the paneled walls of his study, the butler closed the ledger with a soft thump that seemed to seal time itself. He straightened its edges, locked it within the heavy drawer of his desk, and turned the key. A simple brass instrument, but one that, like the keys that opened the wine cellar or the vault room, marked the butler's true power, the power to see, to remember, and to never forget. It was now time to emerge once more into the daylight of visible service. The next stage of the day awaited, and with it came duties that required both diplomacy and invisibility. But in the quiet world of ink and paper, the butler had already passed judgment, adjusted his mental chessboard, and made decisions that would ripple through the household silently, yet inevitably. The butler closed the ledger gently, as though sealing a confession. Its worn spine creaked softly as he slid it into its place in the lockable drawer, alongside a stack of older volumes, quiet sentinels of years past. Each book held a memory, an incident, a scandal veiled in numbers, or a moment of discipline coded into neutral language. But once that drawer was shut, the past was buried, and the present awaited its polishing. He rose from his desk with the same quiet dignity that followed him through every corridor of the house. The door to his study clicked closed behind him, and already his mind turned from names and numbers to surfaces and sheen. If the ledger measured the internal order of the household, then the silver measured its outward grace. To guests, the luster of a tray or goblet was the language of refinement, and to the butler, it was a reflection, not of wealth alone, but of the house's order, discipline, and pride. A tarnished spoon was not just neglect, it was dishonor. Down the narrow hallway, and through the small arch behind the main staircase was the silver pantry, a sanctuary few entered without invitation. Even the footman approached it with reverence, and only when summoned. The room was colder than the others, both by intent and insulation, for warmth bred moisture, and moisture bred ruin. Here, in locked cabinets and lined drawers, lived the curated evidence of generations: polished urns, intricately engraved salvers, decanters whose glass rims caught morning light like the edge of a blade. This was not a place of hurried work, it was a space of ritual. The butler removed his coat and folded it neatly before donning a worn apron made of thick linen, its fibers dulled by years of polish and patience. A low stool sat near the central work table, alongside a box of soft cloths, horsehair brushes, and tins of chalky paste. He selected a pair of candelabra first, their arms curled like frozen vines, with wax residue from last week's dinner still stubbornly lodged in the crevices. He began not with polish, but with inspection. Each object was turned slowly in the hand, rotated against the light, examined with the careful scrutiny of a physician checking a pulse. Was the silver pitted? Had anyone touched it with bare hands, leaving the oily trace of fingers to dim its breath? Were the engravings still sharp beneath the polish, or had some careless underling buffed away a century's detail? The butler trusted few with this task. Even the senior footman lacked the required patience. His fingers worked in slow, controlled circles, the polish paste applied like an ointment to the flesh of a patient, and the metal responded not with thanks but obedience. Gradually, the dullness faded, the fog lifted, and the sheen emerged like the sun behind retreating cloud. Not too bright, for vulgar gleam was the sign of new money, but a gentle knowing luster, like the glint in the eye of a man who's seen everything but speaks little. Between strokes he paused often, not to rest but to breathe in rhythm with the work. The room grew fragrant with the faint scent of polish and cotton and brass hinges. Behind the closed door, the house stirred on, unaware of the sanctity happening beneath its feet. This was the paradox of the butler's role: to be invisible yet central, silent yet essential, absent in voice but ever present in consequence. Glassware came next, a different beast. Crystal had no tolerance for smudges. It betrayed every imperfection like a tattletale, and its clarity was both beauty and burden. The butler lifted a goblet to the window and let it catch the weak winter light, watching for the faintest trace of breath or dust. He wiped it with cloths no larger than a handkerchief, each one folded 4 times and used with military precision. Even the motion of lifting, polishing and turning followed a choreography drilled into him years ago, when he too was a young footman, wide-eyed and trembling before a silver soup tureen. But this was not merely cleaning, it was a kind of reverence. Each item polished was not just a possession, it was a relic of family history. The serving tray used for the current lord's christening, the decanter gifted by a visiting French ambassador in 1832, the knife that once bore the edge of a king's roast. These were not baubles of convenience, they were monuments, and it was the butler's sacred charge to preserve them not only from corrosion, but from irrelevance. A dull goblet was an insult to its lineage. Once or twice he would pause to examine a mark, the faint initials of a silversmith long dead, or the faded crest of a forgotten branch of the family. These discoveries did not bring sentimentality. The butler was too seasoned for nostalgia, but they did remind him that his service was not to individuals, but to a lineage, a continuity of form and ritual that stretched back through generations. And while the names in the ledger changed, the tools of hospitality did not. Outside, the light shifted, and somewhere upstairs, the first bell of the morning rang, a soft chime, indicating that one of the daughters had called for tea. The butler made a mental note, but did not quicken his pace. The candelabra needed one more round of finishing, before they could be returned to their velvet-lined drawer. Even now their surfaces shimmered not with vanity, but readiness. They awaited the evening dinner like soldiers dressed in full regalia, awaiting a call to arms. Once the polishing was complete, the butler returned each item to its place. He wrapped the goblets in soft cloth, sealed the polished tins, and removed his apron, folding it as if it were a garment of state. He washed his hands with cold water, never warm, to preserve the skin's sensitivity and prevent softening. There would be no time to rest. The drawing room would soon need inspection. The footmen were likely dawdling, and the day's guests, some foreign diplomat or a cousin from Bath, were expected by mid-afternoon. But for now, in this small sacred hour, he had preserved something greater than cleanliness. He had preserved illusion, order, history, the gleam of power that made the house appear, to all outside eyes, effortless, and no one would know. No one ever should. By the time the last piece of silver had been polished to the sheen of a mirrored lake, and carefully placed back in its velvet-lined drawer, or on the display cabinet in the dining room, the butler turned toward the next silent ceremony of his day, one that involved no fire, no fork, no family member, and yet held more danger than any of them might suspect. It was time to read the post. Each morning, after the delivery boy had passed through the side gate and handed over the day's letters and parcels, the butler took the correspondence to his small study. No one else ever touched the post before him. Not the footman, not the lady's maid, and certainly not the mistress of the house. That privilege and burden belonged solely to the man whose gloves bore no fingerprints, whose eyes had seen too much, and whose lips moved for no one. The post was his private domain, and while others thought it mundane, he knew its true power. The room where he sat was a sanctuary of paper and ink. It smelled faintly of wax, starch, and damp parchment. Here, in the hush between the clatter of morning fires and the thunder of midday footfalls, he sorted the missives with a gloved hand, placing them carefully into piles, for the master, for the mistress, for the children, for the steward. Some were obvious: bank seals pressed deep into the envelope, government crests smeared by rain, invitations embossed in gold leaf and smelling faintly of rosewater. Others were more elusive. A small envelope from London, with a hurried scrawl, might mean a scandal brewing among distant cousins. A letter sealed in green wax might be from a solicitor, whose services were less legal than discreet. The butler, of course, was not meant to read these letters, not officially, but years of quiet service had taught him that knowledge was protection. A butler who knew nothing was disposable. A butler who knew too much could be dangerous, but also indispensable. It was a fine balance, and he walked its tightrope with the precision of a surgeon. His eyes flicked across return addresses, deciphering whose affairs were unraveling and whose were merely complicated. When he held an envelope to the light, it was not out of idle curiosity. He looked for the heavy folds of inserted notes, the extra weight of a second page, a sign that something was being hidden. In those days, letters bore more than just ink. They held scents: perfume from a secret lover, tobacco from a clubroom tryst, lavender from a mother's hand. These fragrances told stories. The butler could often predict the content before a seal was ever cracked. A letter from the master's acquaintance in Yorkshire would carry the rich, oaky scent of port and betrayal. One from the younger son's Oxford tutor would be sharp with ink and frustration. A thin, trembling envelope from the mistress's cousin might smell of rosewater and desperation, likely asking again for a small loan, a recommendation, or a place to send her unwanted daughter. Occasionally the butler would break a seal, not to betray, but to protect. If the master was away, and a letter arrived bearing markings from the treasury or the courts, the butler would slice the seal with a thin silver letter opener, read its contents and reseal it with the same color wax, and a duplicate stamp he kept locked in a drawer. These tools were not officially his, of course, but they were necessary. A household survived not just on honesty, but on discretion. He read with care, absorbing the rhythm of each sentence, the shade of emotion behind every choice of word. He looked for signs of trouble, debts, suspicions, threats disguised as business. Sometimes, in the curling script of a mistress to her lover, he found the dangerous seeds of a scandal yet to bloom. Other times, in the brittle Latin of a legal notice, He uncovered impending ruin. He never spoke of these things aloud. He only adjusted the tone of his glances, the structure of his routines, the timing of certain meetings. His interventions were silent, invisible, like a shadow that darkens a room without touching a soul. Even the innocent letters, the invitations to balls, the calls for donations, the seasonal greetings, held meaning. The butler catalogued them mentally, mapping out the social position of the family like a game of chess. An invitation from the Marquess of Devon meant the family was in favour. One from the county magistrate meant obligation. A missing card from the Duke's annual hunt, that meant someone had fallen out of grace, and adjustments needed to be made in seating arrangements and spoken references. He knew how to prioritise what to deliver, and when. If the master was in a mood, a tight mouth and clenched jaw kind of morning, the butler might delay bringing him the estate bill or the letter from a London banker. If the mistress was already tearful, he would wait until evening to deliver the note from her estranged sister. Timing, like placement, was an art. The butler played moods like instruments, orchestrating when to reveal and when to obscure. But even a man as composed as the butler could feel unease. Occasionally, a letter would arrive that made him pause, one with no return address, written in a hand he didn't recognize. Sometimes it was just a merchant, or an artist seeking patronage. But every now and then, it was something darker, a threat, a blackmail note, or a whisper from the past someone wished forgotten. In those moments, he stood still, the candlelight flickering on his waistcoat, the wax pooling beside him, as he weighed what to do. He was not just a servant, he was a sentry, guarding the family from forces without and within. By the time the letters had been sorted, and the trays prepared for each family member, the day had fully begun. Footmen scurried down halls, maids moved like phantoms between rooms, and the family began to stir. The butler, however, had already touched the soul of the house that morning. Through seals and script, through parchment and perfume, he had glimpsed the private burdens of those he served. He bore those secrets, not as weapons but as weights, tucked neatly behind his still eyes and silent mouth. And as he rose to deliver the post, placing each letter with care beside a breakfast plate or atop a writing desk, he left no trace of his labour. The family would lift their envelopes with idle fingers, unaware of the watchful eyes that had already passed their contents. The butler would simply bow and retreat, another invisible gesture in a day, built on unseen authority. As the sun reached its apex and the house grew momentarily still, the grand Georgian estate seemed to hold its breath in that brief interlude between morning rigour and afternoon formality. The relentless shuffle of boot heels on polished wood, the echo of brushes against silver, the muted ring of porcelain, and the low efficient murmurs of maids and footmen, all faded like fog burned off by sunlight. It was not a cessation of labour, for the house never truly slept, rather it was a gentle contraction, a drawing inward, a sigh before the next exhalation of formality. And in this hush, the butler withdrew to his study, not for rest but for recollection. His study, modest but orderly, was his dominion, lined with ledgers, correspondence, carefully stacked inventories, and the faint aroma of parchment and ink. The worn leather chair received him like an old friend, its creaks familiar and patient. The window, high and narrow, admitted only a sliver of daylight filtered through trees, casting fractured shadows across the desk like the bars of a quiet cell. Here, in this hourless pause, he took weak tea from a fine but unadorned cup. Milk, never sugar, never more than 1 cup. He did not eat during this time, nor allow himself indulgence. Midday was not for indulgence, it was for reflection. The tea was symbolic, warm, faintly bitter, and precisely measured, like the life he lived. With each sip, he allowed his mind to gather the fragments of the morning, which maid had been tardy, which tray had been chipped, which letter hinted at instability, which candlestick had been left askew by careless hands. Nothing escaped him, though no one ever saw the full machinery of his thoughts. The household relied on his memory, as much as on his hands, and so he used this half-hour as others might use a ledger, running quiet tallies in his mind. In this pause, he listened, not to voices, but to the breathing of the house itself. The groan of aging beams settling into the day's heat, the faint rattle of windows against a high breeze, the slow tick of the long case clock in the hallway outside his door. These were the sounds of equilibrium, and he took comfort in them, for they suggested all was still in order. Any unfamiliar noise, a sudden knock, an extra footfall, a cough not accounted for, would have shattered this fragile calm, and summoned him instantly to investigate. Downstairs, the servants took their meal in the kitchen, hearty, hurried and filled with chatter, but the butler did not dine with them, nor take part in their laughter. To do so would have blurred a line he could never afford to cross. He was above them in rank, but beneath the family in status, belonging nowhere entirely. Even in the rigid hierarchies of service, he occupied a liminal space, observing, enforcing, remembering, and yet never truly seen. This solitude was not just preference, it was survival. He could not be confided in, lest he be compromised. He could not confide, lest he betray the silence his station demanded. He sometimes gazed at the mantel in his study, where a single portrait hung, not of himself, of course, but of a predecessor, long dead. The butler of 3 generations prior, a stern man with tight lips and eyes, as unreadable as slate. The current butler had never known him, yet he studied the portrait often, searching not for familiarity, but for inheritance. This image reminded him that his role was part of a lineage, not of blood, but of function. He was merely the current vessel for a centuries-old tradition of service. He was not permitted to have ambitions beyond duty. The tea cooled quickly in the porcelain cup, and he sipped until it tasted like nothing at all. He used these moments also to prepare for the afternoon's engagements. If guests were to arrive, ladies from the neighbouring estate, or perhaps a visiting rector, it was he who had already coordinated their reception, who knew precisely when the footman should open the front doors, where the drawing-room cushions should be fluffed, and which blend of tea would best suit the sensibilities of the visitor. He memorized allergies, preferences, moods, gossip, and the web of unspoken rules that governed English social ritual. None of this was written. It lived only in him. This was why the midday stillness mattered, not to rest his body, but to tune his mind. Sometimes, as the silence stretched, the butler allowed himself a single luxury, closing his eyes for a few seconds, not to sleep, for he did not dare, but to rest in darkness and listen to the world behind his lids. He had trained himself to hear the difference between a maid's laugh and a scullery boy's giggle, between a servant's polite knock and a family member's impatient rap. Even blind, he could sense if something was amiss in the tempo of the house. His ears were always open, his thoughts always calculating. A door left ajar could mean forgetfulness, or it could mean theft. A missing button on a footman's coat could mean laziness, or a secret tryst the night before. He judged nothing out loud, he noted everything within. This was also the hour in which he reviewed the family's movements. The master would likely retreat to his library or study, pretending at correspondence while dozing behind the Times. The mistress would descend to the conservatory, or embroider in the drawing-room. The children, if young, would be under the care of a governess. If older, they would be away at school, their absence both a relief and a preparation for future disruptions. The butler knew these rhythms, and used them to anticipate the imperceptible needs of the house. If the mistress's embroidery thread had run low last week, he ensured new spools arrived today. If the master had criticized a wine at dinner, he quietly reordered a better vintage before the end of the week. These acts were never acknowledged, never thanked. That was precisely the point. The teacup was finally empty. He did not linger over it. He did not sigh. He simply stood, pushed his chair back with a motion so fluid it made no sound, and began his return to the stage of service. The house would soon breathe again, more loudly now, with guests perhaps, or with the beginning of preparations for supper. Maids would again bustle, footmen would straighten jackets, and the cook would begin her slow descent into anxiety. The butler, however, would glide into position like the conductor of a silent symphony, invisible yet essential, respected yet unacknowledged. As the clock in the hallway struck 1, he stepped out of his study. The brief stillness was over. The world moved again. Beneath the polished floors and velvet draperies of the Georgian estate, below the tapestries and the oil paintings of long-dead ancestors, there existed another world, less visible, but no less intricate. This was the world of the servants' hall, the corridors of the basement kitchens, the sculleries and the pantries, and above all the quietly humming machinery of domestic life. At the heart of this subterranean society stood the butler, not merely a servant among servants, but a figure of profound and almost sacred authority. He was not a master, yet he ruled. He held no title, yet he governed a realm built on deference, discipline, and the unyielding rhythms of propriety. His was a power both absolute and invisible, exerted not with bluster or shouts, but with the quiet assurance of a man who knew that to be obeyed, one must only raise an eyebrow. The servants' quarters operated like a small village, rigid, ritualistic, and bound by custom. Every morning, once the house had been awakened, fires tended, silver polished, tea trays delivered, and letters sorted, the butler descended again, not to retreat, but to assume his other, more complex role. He was the manager, the mediator, the keeper of standards. His domain was not measured in rooms, but in people, in the glances exchanged between scullery maids, in the crisp folds of a footman's livery, in the unspoken fear that a missed chore might summon his quiet disapproval. The morning inspection began not in grandeur, but in silence. As the household busied itself above, the butler's steps echoed in the stone passages below. He walked slowly, methodically, hands clasped behind his back, his eye noting everything. The scuff of a poorly cleaned floor, the absence of a bonnet where one should be, the lingering smell of improperly doused coals in the laundry hearth. He did not correct aloud. Not yet. That came later. Now, he absorbed, mentally filing away each deviation from the house's invisible standard. The household functioned as a living organism, and any disruption in its quiet breathing was something he would later extract, like a surgeon removing a splinter too small for the eye to see. Each servant, from the lowest kitchen girl to the senior housemaid, understood the weight of his gaze. His presence was not theatrical. It was solemn, quiet, and absolute. He rarely raised his voice. He did not need to. A withering glance, a pause in a sentence, even the silence following an unacknowledged, "Good morning, mister," such was enough to prompt immediate self-correction. For the staff, the butler embodied the expectations of the household, its rhythms, its priorities, and its disdain for sloppiness. His approval was a currency, and his disappointment a quiet ruin. The staff were not just laborers, they were roles within a play that never ended. The housemaid must know the exact turn of a doorknob that would not squeak. The cook must remember that the master detested time. The footman must place the wine decanter on the table with no sound of glass touching wood. These things were not preferences, they were laws, and the butler enforced them not as punishments, but as the fulfillment of his sacred duty to the household. When corrections were made, they were delivered privately. A quiet word in the hallway, a brief pause beside the scullery sink, or a note slipped under a door. He did not shame in public. His authority was not bolstered by drama, but by steadiness. Yet the consequences of disappointment were deeply felt. A missed detail could result in reassignment to the most thankless duties, scrubbing chamber pots, cleaning boots in the freezing yard, or worse, being quietly replaced. And still, despite this fear, there was admiration, even respect. The footmen, with their polished buttons and straight backs, secretly aspired to emulate him. The housemaids, though they whispered about him in the laundry rooms, maintained spotless aprons when he passed. The cook, though she grumbled about his meddling, always corrected her own errors before they reached his attention. He was in their world, the embodiment of discipline, order, and pride. During the midday lull, after the family had lunched, after the silver had been returned, after the last footman had brushed the crumbs from the dining cloth, the butler would often convene a quiet meeting, not formal, but ritualistic in its own way. Seated at the long wooden table in the servants' hall, he would read aloud from the duty roster. Assignments for the afternoon were confirmed. Adjustments were made. Special guests meant rearranged room inspections. A sick maid's duties would be redistributed. A footman might be reassigned to travel duty, if the carriage was being prepared. Each word he spoke was weighed and purposeful, never excessive, never too familiar. His leadership extended beyond tasks. In times of tension, when guests were difficult, or illness spread, or the master returned in foul spirits, the butler's calm steadiness was the axis on which the household turned. He offered no comfort, yet his very presence was a balm. The staff knew that as long as he remained unshaken, all could still be salvaged. He knew their histories. He knew who sent wages home to a widowed mother, who flirted too much, who had once broken a vase and hidden it. These things he kept to himself, stored in that silent ledger behind his eyes. He never gossiped, never betrayed, and in that silence, he earned a trust deeper than affection, trust forged in discipline, consistency, and unwavering fairness. The butler was not one of them, not truly. He did not drink with the footman, or chat with the kitchen staff. His meals were taken alone. His quarters, though modest, were separate, yet he belonged to them in a way the family upstairs never could. He knew what it was to serve, to toil in silence, to be overlooked, and so he guarded his staff fiercely, though he never said so. If a maid was wrongly blamed for a broken glass, he would take the matter up quietly. If wages were late, he would speak to the master's secretary. He advocated without spectacle, loyal to the house, but never blind to fairness. In this way, the butler's authority was not only administrative, it was moral. He was the compass by which the staff navigated their endless days of repetition. And so, as afternoon light crept into the servants' hall, warming the stone floor just slightly, the butler stood again from his wooden chair, nodded once to his assembled staff, and disappeared back into the labyrinthine duties of the day, unthanked but essential. An invisible conductor, to an invisible orchestra, playing a symphony of dusted banisters, gleaming candlesticks, and quiet obedience. The afternoon air within the grand house was often tinged with a kind of expectant tension, subtle but unmistakable, the kind that arose not from crisis, but from the anticipation of performance. For in a house such as this, sprawling, storied, and socially perched, the arrival of guests was never a simple affair. It was not the mere business of answering a bell and opening a door. It was, for the butler, a ceremonial unfolding, a quiet test of poise, memory, and mastery. The world might see only the gentle incline of his head, or the neutral elegance of his posture, but beneath that surface lay a mind in constant motion, sifting through years of associations, decoding the unspoken, and aligning the present with the ghost of the past. The butler stood not merely at the threshold of the estate, but at the very edge of the family's social boundaries. He was the gatekeeper of appearances, of honor, of secrets too delicate to name. Long before the crunch of carriage wheels announced the arrival of any visitor, he had already prepared. Cards were reviewed, names repeated silently, scandals cross-checked in the quiet corridors of his mind. Titles were rehearsed, not just the official ones, but the whispered ones. Lady so-and-so with the gambling brother, Mr. This or That, whose last visit ended in a shouting match. Colonel Watch's name, who'd once drunk too much and mistaken a hallway for the garden. Memory, to the butler, was not just a faculty, it was a survival skill, honed with the edge of discipline and polished by decades of repetition. His gloves were always the same, white, impeccable, a shade not unlike the linen he inspected daily, but without the warmth of domesticity. They were the gloves of diplomacy, of distance. He wore them like armor, and when the knocker struck brass, or the bell echoed from the side door, it was not with surprise but with stillness that he responded. He did not rush. Speed in a man of his station was vulgar. Every step he took toward the front entrance was measured, deliberate, ceremonial, as if the very floorboards expected deference. Guests arrived in all shapes and temperaments, from the flamboyant to the furtive. Some burst through the door in clouds of perfume and laughter, others with a kind of predatory grace, assessing everything and everyone within sight. The butler's greeting was always the same, neither too warm nor too cool, neither inviting nor dismissive. He bowed his head with the weight of centuries in his spine, as though his very bones remembered feudal loyalties. He used names sparingly, titles properly, and never, under any circumstances, displayed recognition that was not explicitly offered. And yet, he knew them all, their histories, their feuds, their social climbing, their falls from grace. It was not enough to recognize a face. He had to recall the unspoken currents that connected guest to host, friend to rival, cousin to scandal. He remembered which lady could not stand the other, which gentleman had once flirted too boldly at a dinner 3 years prior, which child now grown was to be praised for a recent engagement, or delicately ignored for the lack thereof. And while he offered coats to be taken, umbrellas to be dried, gloves to be stored, he was watching, always watching. The shoes told stories, the quality of polish, the scuff of travel, the hands revealed nervousness, arrogance, or shame. A misplaced glance between two guests could ignite weeks of household rearrangements to avoid unwanted proximity at meals. He guided guests with elegance, not merely to rooms, but to moments. The drawing room for casual callers, the conservatory for those deemed genteel but less favored, the library for those whose presence suggested discretion. He never asked the family for instructions. He didn't need to. He had learned the invisible map of preference long ago, and when needed, he made the delicate calculations himself, knowing when to delay a guest's entry by moments to avoid an awkward meeting, or when to accelerate one to create an illusion of coincidence. Sometimes, when the household was especially alive with activity, guests upstairs, preparations below, he could feel himself at the center of a human clockwork, a keeper not of time, but of order. Even his silences had weight. A pause before responding could signal disapproval or concern. A slight hesitation in offering a particular vintage of wine might register with those who understood. He never offered opinions, yet his every motion could steer an outcome. And when evening drew near, and the house brimmed with visitors, some expected, some not, he moved through the rooms like a shadow with purpose. He ensured glasses were refilled before being empty. He signaled the footman with subtle glances. He intercepted a letter that might embarrass the lady of the house. He nudged the dining room arrangements just slightly to allow Lady Thistlethwaite to sit not beside the man who'd once jilted her, but across from her cousin, whose chatter could drown out discomfort. When laughter swelled and the chandeliers flickered, and the house seemed to breathe a little faster under the weight of so many histories converging at once, the butler stood still, always still, as if his immobility alone kept the chaos at bay. When the guests departed, he would again retrieve names and coats and titles with flawless precision, and if someone left in anger, or in tears, or without saying goodbye, it was he who bore silent witness. Later, long after the door closed and the lock turned, long after the family had retreated upstairs, and the servants below had begun the long work of restoring calm, the butler would sit in his study with his ledger, and he would write nothing of what had occurred. No scandal, no tension, no impolite word, but he would remember it all, for he knew that guests returned, and history rarely left a house. It only changed shape, whispered in new voices, arrived in different coats. In the end, for the butler, every guest was a chapter in the household's long and quiet story, and he, though uncredited, was its quiet archivist, polite, invisible, immovable, watching always, speaking rarely, forgetting never. As the quiet hours of early afternoon slid into the social rituals of polite visiting, the great house stirred again, not with the roar of drama or toil, but with the rustling hush of hushed conversation and gloved hands smoothing skirts. This was the hour of the afternoon call, when neighboring ladies, often of equal rank or modest ambition, came in curated waves to sip thin tea from porcelain and pass judgment in soft voices. It was an unspoken ballet of status and custom, and while the family smiled in parlors and drawing rooms, the butler lingered just outside the edge of light and laughter, watching, always watching. To the casual eye, he was absent. He was not part of the event. He was neither guest nor family nor servant, meant to be seen bustling trays or pouring tea. That was left to the footmen and maids. The butler was a shadow among shadows, but that very absence was his strength, and in that invisibility, he saw more than any present guest could ever guess. He learned more in a single afternoon of murmured visits than most household members learned in a season. His post was not among the clinking cups, but rather just beyond the doorframe, in the mirrored corridor, beneath the open transom, or behind the silk-curtained vestibule, where words passed like smoke, but lingered like perfume. Afternoon calls were short by design, but long in implication. 15 minutes, 20 at most, but every second was weighted. A nod too long, a laugh too light, a question left unanswered. Each was noted, compared, remembered. And for the butler, who had studied the slow dance of status his entire adult life, such moments were not mere entertainment. They were intelligence. He could recognize the subtle shift in tone that preceded a falling out. He knew the chill of a polite dismissal masked as praise. He could measure the respect a guest paid by the care with which she placed her gloves, or whether she drank the tea fully, or left it barely touched. He did not need to read letters to understand scandal. He could read the human face instead, and yet, his knowledge was never expressed aloud. It was stored, meticulously, wordlessly, behind his pale eyes and carved stone expression. He did not gossip. That was a lower servant's weakness. He did not reveal confidences, not even to the master. But he acted upon them, silently adjusting how doors were opened, how names were announced, which letters were delivered promptly, and which arrived fashionably late. His role was to absorb the unspoken truths of the house and hold them in perfect stillness, like a sealed decanter that never spilled. Afternoon calls gave him endless material. He knew, for example, that Lady Harrowfield was feigning loyalty to the mistress, and that her compliments were edged with sugar-coated venom. He had seen the way she looked at the eldest son, and the way she avoided the youngest daughter, whose inheritance, though not yet public, was known to him by virtue of an overheard whisper in the library corridor months before. He knew which women pretended friendship for political alignment, and which stayed away because their pride still smarted from a forgotten snub at a long-ago harvest ball. He knew the cost of every dress, the age of every child born out of season, the exact month when one guest had fled to the coast for her health, and returned with new jewelry, but no husband. Even as he stood behind a mirrored doorframe, or drifted past like smoke in the corridor, the house gave him everything. The floorboards betrayed footfalls. The slight strain of the servants' voices as they announced names, too formal, too tight, too nervous, told him whether the guest was welcome or merely endured. The rustle of skirts, the closing of parasols, the careful order of seating, all were pages in the book of the afternoon visit, and he read them cover to cover, every single day. And yet, none of it altered his demeanor. The butler did not betray his thoughts. He greeted guests with the same bowed head and careful pronunciation regardless of whether he respected or pitied them. His glance neither lingered nor fled. He acknowledged coats and canes with the gravity of a priest receiving sacraments, but behind his calm eyes, the ledgers of memory filled with each passing afternoon. There, in the stillness, he recorded the unrecorded history of the house. Sometimes, a guest would ask after him directly, curious perhaps about the man who seemed to know everything but say nothing. "Your butler is most reliable," a lady would murmur to the master. "So very discreet." The master would nod, unaware that the compliment was only half the truth. Reliability was part of his job. Yes, but the true art was discretion sharpened by knowledge. The butler was no blank slate. He was an archive with legs, bound in wool and silence. The servants too knew better than to underestimate his presence during the afternoon calls. A clumsy footman who brushed too close to a guest's skirts, a maid who smiled too brightly at a visiting cousin, all were noted, not punished immediately. No, the butler did not rule by reaction. He ruled by memory. Weeks later, a reassignment, a lost privilege, a sudden lack of favor might follow. None would trace it back to that afternoon misstep, but all would suspect. The house lived on rhythm and recollection, and the butler was the clock and the book. When the guests finally left, their scent lingering faintly in the air, the tea grown cold on delicate porcelain, the house did not breathe a sigh of relief, but the butler did, not aloud, not visibly, but in the subtlest release of tension as he turned from the drawing-room threshold and walked back to the corridor. His posture remained straight, his steps deliberate, but his mind began its quiet process of sorting, filing away today's words, gestures, errors and intentions into the invisible library he carried behind his composed face. The drawing rooms were silent again, the chairs slightly askew, the teaspoons resting in bowls of quiet sugar. The parlour's conversation was over, but the house had learned much, and the butler, keeper of keys, silence, silver, and secrets, had learned even more. He did not speak of what he knew. He simply adjusted the balance of the world, ever so slightly. Below the manor's polished floors, beneath the ticking of distant clocks and the hush of velvet-draped drawing rooms, stretched a hidden world of stone and silence. The wine cellars, deep and shadowed, where the air was always cool and slightly damp, and where time itself seemed to move differently. Here, the butler descended each afternoon, not as a servant, but as a guardian of memory, of ritual, of reputation. The stone steps he trod had been worn smooth by years of similar descents, by other butlers before him, by boots long forgotten, by quiet hands that once tended to bottles now crumbling with dust. Each tread echoed softly, like the footsteps of someone following, but he never turned. No one else was allowed down here. The wine cellar was his sanctuary, a vault of both vintage and secrecy. Wooden racks stretched from floor to ceiling, some bowed slightly from the weight of decades. Cobwebs clung to corners where light never reached, and in the heavy hush, the faintest creak of a cork or crack of a bottle shifting was magnified. The air held a scent that could not be found anywhere else in the house. Earthy stone, dry oak, traces of fermentation, and the faint sour tang of time. He moved through the cellar with habitual care, holding a brass lantern with a slow, measured hand, its golden light playing across bottles nestled like sleeping relics. His gaze swept the labels, some written in faded ink, some smudged or entirely vanished, but he knew them by heart. He knew the reds brought over from France when the master was newly wed. He knew the white wines from German vineyards purchased during a summer holiday no one now spoke of. He knew the sherries and ports reserved for aunts with weak constitutions and stronger opinions. Each bottle was more than drink. It was a story sealed in glass, a moment suspended, a gamble of taste and patience. He paused before one particular rack, its contents tucked deeper than most. Here rested the rarest bottles, carefully tilted, wrapped in old cloth to protect their labels. These were not for everyday dinners, or even grand celebrations. These were the wines of last resorts, the ones brought out when alliances were failing, when inheritances were disputed, when the family's fortune or pride needed to be stitched together with a cork and a nod. He checked them one by one, lifting them gently, turning each bottle in silence, looking not for dust, there was always dust, but for moisture, for signs of rot or weakening corks. A leaking bottle was a betrayal not just of the wine, but of the entire cellar's sanctity. Beyond the bottles, there were barrels, low and squat, filled with older stock. He sniffed the air near their staves, testing for signs of mildew or imbalance. He ran his hand across the cool metal hoops, tightening one with a tool kept in a drawer only he had the key to. The cellar was never fully asleep, and neither was he. A good butler knew the precise moment a wine was ready to rise again into the world above, and when it was safer left undisturbed. The wrong bottle served at the wrong moment could mean raised eyebrows, a whispered word from a guest, a letter sent afterward, and these things mattered more than any would admit. Sometimes as he moved through the rows, his mind wandered back to faces and evenings long since past. He remembered the young master's 21st birthday, when a bottle of 1811 champagne had been opened amid fireworks. He remembered the winter when illness swept the household, and no one drank at all, but he still came down here each day, maintaining the order, touching labels as if in prayer. The cellar held these memories better than any diary. It remembered what the family wished to forget. Not all bottles were honest. Some were hidden, intentionally or otherwise. Behind a loose stone, he kept 2 flasks, unlabeled, gifted by a now-dead footman who'd had an eye for distilling and a tongue too loose for service. These were never to be served, only to be remembered. Nearby, an unlabeled rack held wines of uncertain origin, gifts from foreign visitors, offerings from local merchants hoping for favor. These required special care. not for fear of poison, though that fear had once been real, but because unknown wines were like unknown guests, charming until they embarrassed you. The ledger he kept for the cellar was separate from the main household account book, bound in green leather and scuffed at the edges. It was stored in a locked cabinet at the far end of the cellar, next to a small writing desk no one else used. Here, in tight and elegant script, he recorded withdrawals, vintages, names of guests and dates of service, but also his private notes. Lady F. declined second glass. Watch health, or Sir T. preferred 36 Bordeaux over 40. Adjust future menus. These small observations, meaningless in isolation, formed a complex web of understanding that let him manage more than just wine. They let him manage people. Sometimes, particularly in winter, he lingered in the cellar longer than necessary. The manor above might be filled with noise or tension, but down here, everything was predictable. The temperature never changed. The bottles never argued. The shadows never gossiped. He would sit at the writing desk with a wool blanket over his knees, a candle flickering beside him, and make notes in silence while the wine slept around him. It was during these moments that he felt most like the true steward of the estate, the one who outlasted seasons, staff, and scandals. As he prepared to return upstairs, he made one final pass through the central aisle, lantern held aloft, eyes scanning for disturbance. Everything was in order. He locked the door behind him with a solid clack, placed the key on the chain at his waist, and began the slow ascent back to the upper world. His shoes clacked softly on the steps, carrying the dust of the cellar back into the drawing rooms, the dining halls, the corridors where appearance mattered more than age. And though no one in the family would ask where he had been, he knew his absence had been felt. The cellar was his domain, and every glass that clinked at dinner bore the silent fingerprint of his judgment. Above ground the show continued, but below, in the darkness, he had already set the tone. The butler approached the drawing room as one might a chapel, slowly, methodically, without sound or visible thought. The door creaked softly under his touch, not out of neglect, but because the house was old and breathed in its own ancient rhythm. He stepped inside, letting the thick silence of the room wrap around him like velvet. It was early still, too early for the guests, far too early for the family, but not too early for him. For him this was precisely the time to begin his invisible liturgy. The drawing room was not just a room, it was a stage, a temple, a weapon. It represented not merely comfort or taste, but power, quiet power, shown through restraint and expense, communicated in damask and mahogany. And as he moved through it, the butler became not its servant but its conductor, coaxing the air, the furniture, the objects into silent accord. He began with the hearth. The logs had already been selected earlier that day, birch for its clean burn, oak for its slow heat. He placed them one by one in the grate, aligning the ends so that no splinter protruded and no edge was uneven. Ash from the morning fire had already been swept out, leaving the base of the fireplace spotless. A brass fender, polished to a dull gleam, not too bright, never garish, encircled the hearth like a ceremonial boundary. He adjusted it by millimeters, then paused, tilted his head, and stepped back to consider it from 3 different angles before finally nodding in silent approval. Next he moved to the curtains. They were already drawn to filter the failing afternoon light into a soft glow, but he checked them anyway. Every fold was measured with his eyes, every hem assessed for alignment, every tassel straightened with fingers that had done this 1,000 times before. The way the fabric fell, not quite touching the floor, but just brushing it, had to evoke effortlessness. It took effort to look effortless, and the butler knew this truth better than most. The carpet came next. Though it bore no visible dust, he brushed it lightly with a horsehair tool, moving in smooth, deliberate strokes. He was not cleaning it, he was aligning its nap, correcting any disruption caused by careless footsteps earlier in the day. A pattern emerged behind him as he worked, like wind through a field of wheat, so subtle, only he would know it had changed. He turned toward the furniture, the side tables with their polished claw feet, the rosewood escritoire with its secret drawers, the low-set sofa upholstered in fading brocade. Each piece had its place, and each place had its reason. He did not move them often, but when he did, it was with forethought, to shift the tone of the room by a fraction, like lowering a candle by an inch. He wiped a speck of dust from a table leg with a cloth from his pocket, folded the cloth again without looking, and slid it back into place. Then, to the decanters. Cut crystal, refracting the dwindling daylight like quiet fireworks. He lifted each one carefully, checking the clarity of the sherry, the burgundy, the port. His eyes, trained by years, could detect the difference between a cork sealed yesterday and one disturbed an hour ago. Nothing was out of place. Nothing ever should be. He aligned the decanters on the sideboard, port to the left, sherry to the right. The labels turned just enough for the master to read them with ease, and for the guests to squint, should they dare. The glasses were placed in precise rows, thin-stemmed, spotless, humming with the faintest chill from being washed an hour prior. He turned each by the stem, until they all caught the light in the same manner. To the untrained eye, the act would seem obsessive. To the butler, it was balance, order, respect. He examined the floral arrangement next. It was not his doing. Flowers were the domain of the housekeeper, but he took responsibility for its presentation nonetheless. White lilies today, faintly tinged with yellow at the throat, their fragrance barely perceptible beneath the scent of wood polish and aged leather. He adjusted one stem that drooped too low, then gently rotated the entire vase a few degrees clockwise. Now the arrangement looked natural again, as though it had always grown that way, wild and untouched. With a final glance, he checked the framed portraits above the mantel. Their subjects, ancient patriarchs and powdered matriarchs, watched him with eyes painted 2 centuries ago. He gave them the slightest nod, more a ritual than a necessity. Their judgment did not disturb him. He had, after all, upheld their standards longer than anyone now living. Then came the silence, the pause before he left the room. It was his final inspection, one performed not with the eyes, but with the body, the senses. He stood in the center of the drawing room, breathing evenly, listening, the faint tick of the long case clock in the hallway, the crackle of a coal giving way, the far-off echo of a servant's step on the service stairs. These were all he needed. He stepped to the door and turned, surveying the room once more. It did not look ready. It looked inevitable, as though it had never been touched, never been cleaned, never been prepared at all, just born this way, like a tableau in a museum, or a scene from a dream. That was the magic he offered, not to be seen doing, but to make the result seem as though it required no doing at all. He closed the door behind him, without a sound. The room would now wait, like a stage between acts. The drawing room, now perfectly still, would hold its breath until the family entered with their laughter and complaints, their social maneuverings and silken skirts. They would never notice the butler's work. They would never comment on the spacing of the chairs, the precise alignment of crystal, or the freshness of the air. And that was the point. The butler had done his job well when his presence left no trace, only the echo of perfection in a room that dared not whisper his name. As twilight deepened into evening, and the gas lamps flickered to life one by one along the corridors, the butler took his post just beyond the double doors of the dining room, his station for the next hour of quiet vigilance. The great hall, now dimly golden with soft light from the chandeliers, seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of the nightly ritual. Supper for the family was more than nourishment. It was performance, structure, legacy, and for the butler, it was the hour in which his mastery was tested without words, only presence. He stood beside the carved oak paneling, where a narrow recess allowed him to remain partially hidden, yet entirely in command. He did not sit. He never sat. The mere act of lowering himself would suggest rest, and rest was reserved for those who could afford to let go of their vigilance. His hands were loosely folded behind his back. His gaze was steady, but not impolite. His coat, darker than the shadows behind him, lent him an air of stillness so complete that he seemed at times to disappear into the woodwork. The footmen, 2 this evening, 1 senior and 1 junior, moved in carefully practiced patterns around the table. Their footfalls were noiseless on the thick carpet. Each held a napkin draped with quiet elegance over an arm. The senior footman managed the meat, the junior the vegetables and sauces, both guided by silent gestures from the butler, a lift of an eyebrow, a glance to the left, a breath held just a second too long. He spoke rarely, and when he did, it was not with words, but murmurs, low enough to blend with the ticking of the clock or the clink of silver against porcelain. Every aspect of the meal unfolded with the kind of choreography that could only emerge from years of practice. The guests, seated according to strict custom, age, gender, title and relation considered in painful detail, never noticed the butler directly. That was his art. To be invisible and indispensable all at once. They dined by candlelight, their silhouettes dancing across linen and glass, oblivious to the eyes that tracked every sip, every chew, every dropped crumb. The butler knew, from years of observation, the preferences and peculiarities of each family member and frequent guest. Lady Clarissa disliked the pungent Stilton, though she would never say so aloud. The youngest daughter, Anne, harbored a fascination with wine, but only pretended to drink. Colonel Fairchild, when present, expected a second helping of pheasant without asking. The butler anticipated all of this, orchestrating the flow of the meal like a silent conductor. Timing was sacred. Courses must arrive neither too soon nor too late. Conversation, too, dictated the rhythm. A particularly animated anecdote from the master meant the next dish must wait, lest a server interrupt his rising laughter. A lull meant opportunity. The soup could be cleared, the fish brought in, the plates changed without disturbance. All of this, the butler managed with a focus so complete that the ticking of the grandfather clock sometimes seemed to mark the beat of his thoughts. Even the air mattered. The butler had already ensured the drawing room's fire was neither too high nor too low, that the dining room was ventilated, just enough to disperse the aromas of roast and gravy without letting in the evening chill. Each guest's comfort had been quietly accounted for long before they had entered the room. If someone shivered, a servant would appear moments later with an extra log for the hearth. If the wine grew warm, another bottle, already breathing, but still cool, would materialize in the butler's hands. He watched not only the family but the staff. The junior footman knew this season held the decanter at a slight angle that threatened to drip. Nothing had spilled, not yet, but the butler made a note in his mind. There would be a word after supper, a correction delivered without anger, only with expectation. Perfection was not demanded in a single night, but improvement was. At times guests would address him directly. They might ask for a particular wine, or to summon a servant, or even to pass along a compliment to the cook. He would incline his head in acknowledgement, replying in the quiet, perfectly clipped tones of someone who spoke only when needed, and then only with precision. His words were as polished as the silver. The family, despite their manners and elegance, occasionally faltered. A fork clattered to the floor. One of the cousins had laughed too hard at something trivial, and before the sound had faded, the butler had already nodded to the senior footman, who replaced it without hesitation. No glance passed between them. No apology was needed. The butler had managed the moment so completely that the conversation never skipped a beat. Beneath the surface of the meal, other things churned. He listened for subtext, the tension between siblings, the master's sighs, the mother's carefully disguised glances of worry, financial troubles, political shifts, upcoming courtship. These were not spoken aloud, but they revealed themselves in tones, pauses, and nervous gestures. The butler absorbed it all, the way the house absorbed footsteps in its thick carpets. He filed these things away, not out of malice or curiosity, but out of duty. A house must be stable, and stability came from knowledge. When the final course was served, a tart or pudding, always light in summer, heavier in winter, he watched for signs of satiation. Napkins dabbed against lips, the cutlery laid together at an angle, the chairs shifting back ever so slightly. He signaled with a mere movement of a finger, and the footman prepared for clearing. Once the family rose, the butler opened the door precisely 2 seconds before the master reached it. That timing mattered too. It conveyed attention, respect, and a kind of invisible loyalty. No guest ever noticed how often things happened just before they were needed. That was the magic. That was the design. When the room finally emptied, and the servants began their noiseless cleanup, the butler lingered a moment longer in the same corner. He surveyed the table, no major errors, no stains, no drama. The evening had passed as it should, seamlessly, quietly, elegantly. Only then did he step away, his shoes soundless on the floor, his expression unchanged, his presence vanishing into the darkening corridors of the house like smoke fading from a snuffed candle. The dining room, once alive with the clink of porcelain and the soft ripple of aristocratic conversation, had fallen into the hush that always followed a meal. It was not the silence of emptiness, but the dense, expectant stillness that clung to the corners of the grand chamber, like the lingering scent of roasted pheasant and warm cream sauces. The candles flickered low, their wax collecting in sluggish drips down polished brass holders, casting oblong shadows across the damask tablecloth, already bearing the traces of another evening's ceremony. It was at this moment, after the final polite laughter faded and the soft glide of slippers retreated to the drawing room, that the butler took his place once more, not at the table, not with a tray, but as conductor of the unseen symphony that followed the feast. The clearing of the table was not a task. It was a ritual, one that demanded obedience not only to tradition, but to rhythm, timing, and an austere reverence for invisibility. The butler did not raise his voice, he did not shout commands. Instead, he moved with such control and subtlety that a mere glance or lift of an eyebrow could convey an entire sequence of instruction to the footmen flanking the room. They had been trained under his eye to recognize such signals, when to lift, when to turn, when to glide backward through the double doors with a service tray in hand, their polished boots never making a sound on the parquet floors. Each plate removed was handled like fine porcelain, even if the guest had not finished their serving. Each silver fork was lifted with the grace of a religious relic. Napkins were gathered not by grabbing, but by gently folding inward, concealing the stains of gravy and wine from any observer, as though shame had no place on the linen. And in the center of it all, the butler stood as the axis of this silent dance, his hands behind his back, his gaze sweeping slowly from one edge of the room to the other. He noted every movement, every lapse in timing, every uneven step, not aloud, but in the mental ledger he kept for the staff, a record more exacting than the master's accounts ledger, and far more consequential to those who served under him. In the hallway, beyond the dining room doors, the scullery maid stood in the shadows, knowing she must wait precisely for the third return of the footman before entering. Timing was everything. Too soon, and the rhythm would be broken. Too late, and the air of effortlessness would be lost. When she entered, it was like a gust of humility against the grandeur of the dining chamber. She, too, moved silently, collecting the used candle stubs and placing fresh tapers where needed, adjusting the floral centerpiece just so, not for the family, for they had left, but for the image that would remain in memory. In this household, memory was decoration, memory was management. Memory, once formed, could not be tarnished. The clink of porcelain being stacked below stairs was muffled beneath rugs and wooden beams, but the butler heard it. He always heard it, not with his ears, but with his intuition, sharpened by decades of routine, of vigilance, of knowing that the family's peace depended entirely upon the seamless efficiency of the staff's labor that must never show itself. Even now, the wine goblets were lifted not by their rims but by their stems, avoiding fingerprints, avoiding the smudge of presence. The decanters, half full with burgundy or port, were returned to their precise place in the locked cabinet, corked and wiped clean. Every trace of human consumption, of appetite and mess, of disorder, was removed so fully that the table once again resembled the untouched tableau it had been before the first guest arrived. There was no applause for this performance. No thank you. No mention. That was the point. Perfection, in the butler's world, was defined by absence. No sound, no disruption, no attention drawn. And it was in this void that he found both his pride and his prison. For as the family rose from their brandy and strolled toward the drawing room with contented ease, the butler remained behind, watching his army of servants erase the evidence of pleasure. Dishes scraped, but not loud enough to echo. Platters stacked, but balanced perfectly to prevent a tumble. Spills blotted instantly. Salt cellars refilled. Chairs eased back into alignment, 4 fingers width from the edge of the table, and always at the same angle. And then, finally, when the last linen cloth was whisked away and folded with a slow, careful precision, the butler gave a subtle nod. It was over. The feast was gone, its traces hidden, its impact smoothed away like footprints in sand. He allowed himself one slow, measured breath as he stood alone in the room once filled with voices and candlelight. Now only the smell lingered. Cooked meat, citrus and wax, but even that would be gone before the hour struck the next. He checked the time, not aloud, not ostentatiously, just a tilt of the head toward the ornate wall clock, its slow ticking a reminder that all things moved forward, even the perfect order of this dining ritual. Tomorrow there would be another supper, another performance, another disappearance of indulgence, but tonight's had passed into the quiet. The staff dispersed like shadows down the servants' corridor, and the butler stood a moment longer, restoring the silence not just of sound, but of presence. In his mind, he ticked off each item: crystal returned, silver locked, cloth laundered, stains reported, missing items noted. The list was endless and yet always complete by his hand. He left the room last, turning down the sconces one by one, until the flicker died into a hush, and the feast was nothing but a memory that no one upstairs would ever think to question, not because it was hidden, but because it was done perfectly, silently, invisibly, like it had never happened at all. After the last clink of porcelain had vanished into the scullery, and the final whisper of footfall retreated from the dining room, the house exhaled, a long low sigh of ancient timbers settling into night, of soot cooling in iron grates, of servants melting into the bowels of the house to eat their late suppers in shadows. And as the last candle was snuffed in the withdrawing room, the butler began his quiet dominion, the long and solitary ritual of the night watch. There was a ceremony to it, not unlike liturgy. First he would pass through the drawing room once more, walking in a perfect arc, eyes glancing across mantel, decanters, sideboards, hearth rugs, and velvet drapes. His hand would hover above the surface of the occasional table to check for dust, not to find any, for none dared exist, but simply to verify the void. The room now bathed in pale lamplight, its edges soft with silence, had to be left untouched by time. Nothing should suggest that life had happened here, merely an hour before. No lingering scent of claret, no misplaced matchstick, no crumpled napkin. He would move slowly, his shoes soundless on the rug, arms folded behind his back, pausing only to right the angle of a cushion, or adjust a fold and a throw. Then came the locks. He moved through the house with a ring of heavy brass keys, each cut with ancient grooves for doors whose hinges creaked in protest against the years. The library first. The door swung inward, revealing shelves upon shelves, walls that had not changed since the century turned, and an occasional chair by the window where the master once sat with a newspaper and a glass of port. The butler touched the edge of the fireplace with his fingertips, ensuring the embers were out, then turned the key with a deliberate turn, listening for the satisfying click of security. No servant entered this room, unaccompanied. It held letters, ledgers, cigars, documents of land, and sometimes locked drawers whose contents even he never knew. The French doors in the dining room required particular attention. They led to the garden terrace, beautiful by day, but by night, a vulnerability. He would check the handles, press the frame, peer into the night beyond the glass. The moon might spill across the lawn, silvering the hedges, and casting long shadows from the stone urns, but the butler had no fondness for gardens. His domain ended at the door frame. Still, he would linger a moment longer than necessary, hand resting on the curtain cord, listening, not for intruders, but for any deviation in the night's rhythm. A fox's cry, a distant hoot, a strange rustle in ivy, not because he feared, but because he respected the house's hunger for order. Down the corridor, he paused before the parlour where the lady of the house had hosted her afternoon callers. She had since retired to her chambers upstairs, and the room now sat like a painting, still and perfectly composed. Teacups had been washed and returned, but the faint perfume of her presence still hung in the air. The butler did not enter, only glanced in, one hand on the doorknob, then drew the door closed until only the quiet hum of the grandfather clock inside could be heard. From there, he descended the narrow back stair to the wine cellars, more out of habit than necessity. The air cooled noticeably, thick with earth and stone, and his boots made the faintest noise on the steps. Here in the damp silence, he felt closest to the bones of the house. The bottles lay like buried treasure in wooden racks, their necks labelled in fading ink: Chateau Lafite, 1846, Porto, 1851, Claret, 1860. He passed his hand lightly across them, not to touch, only to feel their presence. It was not just wine, it was history sealed under cork, trust measured in vintages. He ensured no cask had shifted, no sign of intrusion, no breach in the sacred cool. Back upstairs, he made his final circuit. He would pass through the long gallery with its ancestral portraits, their faces pale in moonlight, their eyes following him with the indifference of marble. The carpet muffled his steps, but he moved even more carefully here. This was a place of memory. Every generation's shadow passed through this hall. The silence here was deeper, reverent. He checked each window latch, gently nudging them, as if afraid to wake the dead. Then to the servants' quarters. He did not intrude, merely listened, ensuring no murmur of quarrel, no unauthorized candle burned past hour, no footman slipped out under pretense. They feared his presence, and so they slept, or pretended to. He approved of both. Finally, to his own small study, tucked near the kitchen wing, he would sit there briefly, not to rest but to wait. The fire was low, and the teapot was now cold, but he did not mind. He removed the gloves he wore for the final walk, placed them precisely on the edge of the desk, then opened the small black ledger again. A new line. Date. Time of lock. Observations. Drawing room locked. 10:47. Cellar secure. Guest corridor silent. His pen moved with mechanical precision, and when he was done, he closed the book and placed it in the locked drawer beneath the desk. Sometimes he sat a while longer, listening. The house made sounds, even in sleep. Pipes expanding, beams settling, the ticking of the hall clock. It was a language only, he understood. He had heard it for so long now that he could tell if something was amiss not by noise but by silence. A missing creak, an absent drip, a quiet too deep. But tonight, all was well. The butler rose once more, adjusted the cuffs of his sleeves, and extinguished the study lamp. The flame dimmed to a soft glow, then to nothing. Darkness embraced the house. Upstairs, dreams stirred behind velvet curtains. Downstairs the last ember blinked out, and in the void, the butler stood one final moment, still listening, not as a servant, but as the house's last waking thought, before it too fell into sleep. At long last, when the lamps upstairs had dimmed, the dining silver had been polished and stowed, and the murmurs of the drawing-room had surrendered to silence. The butler found himself alone again in his small wood-panelled study at the back of the servants' corridor. It was a narrow space tucked away like a forgotten ledger in a deep drawer, and yet to him, it was a sanctuary more sacred than any drawing-room or library upstairs. Here, at the edge of the sleeping household, he allowed himself one indulgence, a modest glass of port, poured not as a luxury, but as a ritual. The bottle was kept in a locked drawer, away from curious footmen or greedy eyes. It was not a particularly fine vintage, nothing the master would miss, nor something he had ever taken without replacing, but it was sufficient. It warmed the throat and the chest and gave the illusion, however faint, that the long day had been earned. He poured carefully, without haste, tilting the decanter, so as not to disturb the sediment that had settled at the bottom. The port moved like syrup, thick, slow, obedient, and landed in the crystal glass with a dull, satisfying glug. He swirled it once, watched it catch the faint light of the gas lamp, and then sat down without a sound. The chair creaked under him, just slightly, in that way familiar things do when they welcome you. The desk before him was organized to the point of compulsion, an inkwell centered exactly, blotting paper squared with the edge, a brass letter opener, aligned parallel to the ruler beside it. The butler, even in privacy, was not a man who scattered. Discipline followed him like a shadow. Yet in this hour, with his back to the door, and his feet resting gently on a small footstool. He allowed himself a soft exhale, more sigh than breath. Outside the thick glass window behind him, the gardens were blanketed in moonlight. Pale outlines of hedges and gravel paths glowed faintly, like ghosts of the day's order. Beyond that, nothing. Fields stretching into darkness, punctuated only by the occasional hoot of an owl, or the distant bark of a restless dog. The household slept soundly, and it did so, he knew, because he had permitted it to. He sipped the port, not quickly, never quickly. The sweetness clung to the back of his throat, mellowed by years of age and silence. He swallowed and sat, motionless, letting his mind replay the day, not with emotion or attachment. Those belonged to other men, freer men, but with the detached precision of a clerk reviewing accounts. He recalled every footstep that had crossed the foyer, every glance exchanged between the upstairs guests, every hesitation in a maid's voice, every missing spoon or chipped plate. Not a detail had escaped him. His mind was not unlike the wine cellar, cool, dim, and organized by vintage. There was satisfaction in that, though he would never call it so. Satisfaction suggested reward, and his position was not one for indulgence. Still, the glass of port marked the end of the performance. The curtain had fallen. The audience, masters, guests, servants alike, were all gone to sleep, and he, the invisible conductor of the day's symphony, was allowed a moment in the wings. Occasionally he reached for a leather-bound notebook on the desk. In it, written in careful, neat copper plate, were the records of daily happenings, not merely inventory or schedules, but the subtler notes, suspicions, patterns, small improprieties, and moments of pride. He logged everything, not for anyone else to read, no one ever would, but because the act of recording gave shape to his world. The scullery maid had hesitated this morning. Was it guilt, illness, or laziness? Mr. Felton's overcoat had arrived with mud on the hem. Where had he been the night before? The mistress had inquired about port with too much curiosity. Did she suspect something, or was she simply remembering her late father's fondness for it? The pen scratched softly against the page, the only sound in the study. He paused between lines, sipping his port, letting thoughts form without rush. This quiet hour was not merely for reflection, it was strategy. The butler understood that while the day was for the master's needs, the night was his to guard, his time to prepare for the unseen threads that would tug tomorrow. A servant who planned only for the moment would always be running behind, but he, who sat with port in hand and foresight in mind, would always remain a step ahead. He did not smile, even in solitude. His face remained neutral, practiced, almost stern. Smiles, like emotion, were reserved for the family, and used sparingly, like a fine lace curtain pulled back only when necessary. Here, in the study, the butler was not performing. He was simply existing. The port dwindled slowly. He savored the final mouthful longer than the first. Outside, the clock in the front hall gave its soft chime, 11:30. Soon he would rise and make his final rounds. Check the bolts, feel the warmth of the hearths, touch doorknobs to ensure they were firmly closed. He knew the house intimately, not just its layout, but its moods. A window left ajar had a voice, a rug out of place whispered of inattentiveness. His job was not only to serve, but to listen to the house itself. When the glass was empty, he did not linger. He wiped the rim, returned it to its cabinet, replaced the bottle, and locked the drawer with the small iron key that hung inside his waistcoat. No trace would be left. No one would suspect, though many might imagine. That was always the balance, to be present without appearing, to act without acknowledgement. He stood, straightened his jacket, and glanced once more at the book upon the desk. Tomorrow's page was still blank, but not for long. With the lamp turned down and the study door latched behind him, the butler disappeared again into the hush of the corridor, a guardian of ritual, a steward of silence, and in this hour, just briefly, a man at peace in the ticking twilight of his own design. He moved through the house like a shadow, felt, never heard, known, but seldom seen. And in that quiet glide through corridors, in the endless orchestration of candles, keys, letters, linens, and looks, The butler had come to know more than any man outside the family ever should. But knowledge in his world was not a currency to be spent. It was a burden to be carried, silently, indefinitely. The things he knew were as much a part of the house as the paintings on the walls, or the dust in the beams, unseen by most, but deeply settled, impossible to dislodge. He knew, for instance, that Lady Eleanor's third child was not sired by her husband. He had seen the letters, had recognized the sudden silences between rooms where music once played freely, had noted how the footman assigned to the greenhouse was transferred overnight, sent away with no reference, no word, no warning. He had watched her eyes for weeks afterward, the way they avoided mirrors, the way they lingered too long on nothing at all, but he said nothing, and nothing changed, at least not outwardly. The child grew, the estate held its rhythm, and the lie was folded neatly into the family's history like a pressed waistcoat. He knew where the silver went, year by year, piece by piece. Not stolen exactly, but borrowed, pawned, discreetly exchanged when the accounts ran low, and appearances had to be upheld. He knew which cupboard the decoy pieces were kept in, where real silver had once shone, now replaced with expertly tarnished imitations. He never asked questions, never recorded their absence in the ledgers, simply adjusted the inventory in his head. When guests dined, he ensured the lighting was just so, dim enough to flatter, soft enough to conceal, and so the illusion endured, as illusions must in houses like this. There were things not written in any family tree, that he had nonetheless memorized with grim clarity. The son who was quietly institutionalized after a scandal in the city. The daughter who had a cough one summer, and returned from Italy thinner, quieter, with a nun's silence about her. The cousin whose name was no longer spoken in the drawing room. The guests who arrived with titles and charm, but were never invited twice. These absences became their own sort of presence, invisible occupants of the house, and he moved around their memories with practiced care, avoiding the mental creaks in the floor. He knew the master's tempers better than the master himself did. He knew when to leave the decanter full, and when to leave it empty. He knew which books to shelve prominently when the bishop came, and which to hide when the banker did. He knew that when the eldest son returned from university with a slight accent and an overconfident step, it would take 3 brandies and a sharp word from the patriarch before the house would breathe easily again. He knew all of this, not because he had been told, but because he had watched, always watched. He had learned to read silences more fluently than speech. A slammed door on the east wing meant the governess was gone. A lingering perfume in the corridor meant someone had arrived, or someone had stayed too long. A scuff on the wallpaper, a missing book from the study, a forgotten glove on the banister, each told him a story, and though he knew them all, he recorded none. Not in ink, not in memory, at least not in the way others might. His recollections were dustless, clinical, archived beneath layers of duty and self-erasure. He was a man of memory, but not of recollection. The younger servants speculated, of course. They whispered in the scullery, behind half-shut doors, in the garden when they thought no one heard. They wondered why he was so quiet, so composed, so impossibly discreet. They joked that he had buried bodies beneath the wine cellar, or that he had once been in love with the mistress of the house. But he paid no attention to speculation. His discipline was not merely professional, it was existential. He existed only so long as his silence held. To speak, even once, would be to unmake the very role he occupied. He understood this with a clarity that bordered on reverence, and so he remained still. He offered no confidences, sought none in return. When a housemaid collapsed in tears, he handed her a handkerchief, not advice. When the cook raged over a ruined dish, he adjusted the timing of the next course. When the master's voice rose behind closed doors, he ensured the other doors remained shut. He was not a confessor, not a friend, not a witness. He was the wall, the lock, the veil, and in being so he protected them all, even from themselves. There were nights when, seated in the dim light of his small study, the clock ticking solemnly beside him, he would allow the memories to drift to the surface. Not vividly, not emotionally, but as shadows cast by a lantern across the page of time, He would sip his port and stare at nothing. Perhaps he would allow himself to think of a name, or a face, long gone, but he never lingered. Reflection was dangerous. Nostalgia, corrosive. His role was not to feel but to preserve, to ensure that everything continued as though nothing had ever changed. He imagined sometimes that after his death, quiet, unremarkable, in some corner of the servants' quarters, a curious new butler might stumble upon his belongings. A drawer filled with carefully maintained keys, a journal with blank pages, a portrait in which he stood behind the family, just out of focus. That new butler might wonder who he had been, but they would find no answers, because the real stories were never written, never spoken, never even truly thought. They were simply kept, like heirlooms too fragile to display. The butler did not think of himself as a keeper of secrets. That implied intention, strategy. He was simply a vessel into which the household's truths had poured, drip by drip, year by year, until he had become not a man but an archive. And archives, if well made, do not speak. They endure, and so he endured. As the final embers of the drawing-room fire dimmed to ash, and the faint echo of footsteps disappeared into the upstairs corridors, the butler sat in the narrow passageway between the pantry and the back stairs, his polished shoes just barely brushing the cold flagstones. The house was finally still, not quiet, for there was no such thing in a structure that groaned with its own weight and whispered through plaster and pipe, but still in that heavy cloistered way only an old house could be when its occupants had gone to sleep, leaving their echoes behind them. And there he remained, in the precise place his position had fixed him, halfway between the opulence above and the toil below, belonging wholly to neither. His name was never spoken at table, not truly, not in the way one says a friend's name, or calls a brother in the garden. When the family referred to him, it was the butler, or perhaps Mr. followed by his surname, if he was fortunate, or the mood generous. He had learned long ago that such address was not a courtesy, but a classification, no different than calling for the groom, or the cook, or the stable boy. It marked him as necessary, dependable, and present, but not personal. He could be known deeply, yet never truly acknowledged. Years had passed, decades even, in this twilight space between servitude and authority. The underservants, the maids and scullery girls and pantry boys, had come and gone in tides, some bright and full of hope, others ragged from disappointment, all eventually worn down to nothing more than memory and chalked initials on the attic beams. He remembered them all, knew where each had stood in line on their first day, knew who had cried in the pantry, who had stolen jam from the larder, who had fallen in love behind the orchard wall. He remembered too, who had left in disgrace, and who in a pine box. Their stories nested silently within him, never spoken aloud, never asked after, and above him, the family, their names etched on silver napkin rings and monogrammed linens, their portraits hung along the gallery in grand varnished succession. They changed more slowly, the generations folding one into the next like careful pages. He had served 3 masters of the house, and 2 mistresses, watched the current lady as a child, now presiding over dinner parties with the same steely poise her mother once wielded. They smiled at him sometimes, thanked him on rare occasions, but none had ever asked what he had wanted from life. Because that, of course, was not the arrangement. He was not here to want. He was here to ensure that they had what they wanted, when they wanted it, with no sign of effort having occurred in the process. His own desires, should he have remembered them, were irrelevant, absurd, even dangerous. A butler with ambition was a contradiction, a tool with a will, and yet, beneath the starched exterior, the polished manners, and the straight spine, there had once been a boy who had liked to read in corners, who had known the taste of summer strawberries picked too early, who had once walked through dewy grass at sunrise, and thought the world, just perhaps, belonged to him. That boy had vanished slowly, not through violence or disaster, but through the long erosion of duty. One missed outing, one birthday ignored, one friend not written to. He had been sanded down until there was nothing left to splinter. only smooth surfaces and a silence that could not be broken. He had family, once. A sister who had married poorly and died early, a brother gone to sea and never returned, a mother who had cried the day he first wore livery. There had been letters, sporadic and hopeful at first, then fewer, and finally none. The house became his entire world, not by choice, but by quiet, creeping necessity. In this world he mattered, but only in the way a grandfather clock mattered, reliable, ornamental, always ticking in the background, never spoken to unless it stopped. Sometimes, in the deep hours of the night, he wondered if he had disappeared entirely, become not just anonymous in name, but in soul. He could go for days without hearing his own voice rise above a whisper, weeks without touching another person in anything but formality. He read reports, inventories, ledgers. He signed his name, but only in ink, never in meaning. He was not lonely in the conventional sense. He had company, laughter in the kitchens, polite conversation in the hallways, but he was alone in the profound way only those without peers can be. There were small rebellions, of course, moments when he dared to shape his own reality. He selected the port he drank each night, not the one served at table, but the one he preferred. He arranged the books in the library, not alphabetically, but by tone, hiding the ones he liked best behind others. He kept a photograph in his drawer of a dog he had once owned, long dead, unnamed by the family, buried behind the stables with no headstone. These were his treasures. Not gold or silver, but memory and resistance, smuggled in under the cover of obedience. When the time would come, and it surely would, for him to leave this world, he knew it would be with little fanfare. No marble plaques or grand funerals, perhaps a line in the parish record, a nod from the vicar. If he was lucky, a pensioned cottage near the sea. But most likely, another butler would take his place within the month. The wine would still be served at the right temperature, the silver would still shine, and the family would carry on. Their lives uninterrupted, their world undisturbed, just as it had been designed to be. And he, the butler, the one who had kept the house alive like a heart, keeps a body beating, he would become part of the house's long memory, not as a name, but as a presence, a handprint worn smooth into the banister, a faint scent of lavender in the pantry, a door that never quite closed the same way again. In this way, perhaps, he would endure, not celebrated, but not entirely forgotten either. And so, night after night, as the house sighed into slumber, the butler returned to his post, not with pride, not even with contentment, but with a practiced stillness. A man without a first name, without a voice raised in his own defense, without a history written in the family record. He existed in the space between necessity and invisibility, carrying the weight of a life lived in service of others, a weight measured not in gold, but in silence, and in that silence, he endured. The story closes where it began, with a breath before dawn, and the familiar hush of polished shoes over stone floors. The butler's world, wrapped in ritual and restraint, remained unchanged, untouched by the shifting tides outside the manor gates. His first steps of the day echoed the last of the night before, part of a ceaseless rhythm of duty. Every action, from adjusting a candlewick to locking the final door, was performed with the same calm precision he had mastered over years of silent observation and invisible labor. There was no applause, no gratitude, only the reassurance that everything remained in its place, because he had placed it there. And so, the day began anew, indistinguishable from the one that had just passed, and from the one that would follow. The great house stirred, but only after he had prepared the stage. The butler, neither master nor servant in the ordinary sense, walked again into silence, eternal in his station, vanishing into the background of a world he maintained but never owned, a figure both vital and forgotten, like the ticking of a clock behind a locked door.